Huh? 155 millimeter howitzers, right. And 155 millimeter cannon. Yeah. What? Do I know the difference between a howitzer and a cannon? Yeah, of course I do. Yeah. All right, talk soon. Bye. July 29th, 1951. There are many nations fighting this war outside of the Korean forces, the Americans and the Chinese, the largest contingents. And this week, some of those other forces organized themselves into a larger fighting force. The British and Commonwealth brigades and battalions become the 1st Commonwealth Division. I'm Indy Neidell, and it is a rainy and thundery day here in the Far East, and this is the Korean War. Last week, the ceasefire negotiations at Kaesong continued, with the continued presence of foreign military forces, and what actually defined foreign military forces, being at the forefront of discussions. But by the end of the week, at least the general agenda for the talks had been agreed upon. I've got into what the various sides ideally expect from the talks, but here's a quite succinct quote to sum up the situation from the UN perspective. The general outlines of the JCS strategy were simple. Unless a global war broke out, the US forces would remain in Korea and exert pressure upon the enemy to encourage him to negotiate. There would be no military victory in this limited war, but the UN commander would have considerable latitude in the use of the military forces under his command. Patience, perseverance, and pressure keynoted the US position. But would these be enough to persuade the enemy to come to terms? UN Forces Commander Matt Ridgway has several hats to wear and a lot of responsibilities. Other than UN Commander, he's also America's SINCFI, Commander-in-Chief Far East. And he also administers Japan as Supreme Commander Allied Powers. And he's even Governor of the Ryukyu Islands. He has Doyle Hickey as Chief of Staff for all of that, but the last one of those. The main force in Korea is, of course, the 8th Army under Jim Van Fleet. 8th Army is organized into 4 corps, and at the end of last month, it reported a strength of 554,777 men. There are 17 divisions, with 7 of those American, and the other 10 ROK, South Korean, or ROK. On top of that are 4 brigades, a separate regiment, and 9 separate battalions. Breaking down the local manpower numbers, you get 253,250 American troops, 28,061 from other UN members, and 260,548 ROK. There are 12,718 Koreans assigned to work with the US units as Katusa, Korean augmentation to US Army. Ridgway is quite confident that he can man the defenses in the Korean peninsula as long as the war doesn't expand and stays fairly limited. What he really wants in order to do this effectively is more artillery and artillery crews to run it, which he feels the enemy is especially vulnerable to when it's massed. He wants 5 155mm howitzers, 4 8-inch howitzers, that's 203 millimeters, 1 155mm cannon, and 2 observation battalions. You may be wondering what the difference between a howitzer and a cannon is. Howitzers can fire both direct and indirect fire, since they can fire at higher launch angles. They have a shorter barrel and fire at essentially medium velocity, whereas a cannon, or just gun, has a longer barrel and a high velocity and is designed for flatter trajectories and direct fire. There was little question over the desirability of this augmentation in Washington, but Ridgway's requirements were only part of the picture. Actually, the artillery increases when added to Ridgway's other requests would necessitate raising the FEC troop ceiling by 57,000 spaces if all were approved. The only way that the Army could fill Ridgway's demands completely would be by increasing the overall strength of the Army establishment. Since this was not practicable at the moment, G3 suggested that by taking 5,000 men from the General Reserve and 5,000 from the shipment scheduled to strengthen the European Command, at least part of FEC's needs could be met. They are actually getting plans together to do some of this, so we'll have to check back in a few weeks and see how it's going. They want to do it because they are not fools, they are not naive. They are well aware that as the negotiations drag on, the enemy is building up his forces. They figure that at any old time, their enemy can launch attacks with a superiority at point of contact at maybe 4-1. lasting a month, and using up to 46 divisions and over 1,000 planes. Okay, enemy divisions are smaller than UN ones, sure, but still, that is a lot to have against Van Fleet's 17 divisions. Can he really handle such an attack? Well, he did great holding off the offensives in April and May and dealing out some serious punishment. But what if they need backup? There are but 7 U.S. Army divisions back at home, and even within a couple months from now, only 3 of those will be fully trained. One of these 3, the 82nd Airborne, is the entire Army Strategic Reserve, the global one. And the other 2, the 28th and 43rd Infantry Divisions, they're supposed to go to Europe later this year. Okay, by then, the 11th Airborne will also be in the Strategic Reserve. But the other 3 divisions here, 31st and 47th Infantry and 1st Armored, will not be available until early 1952. U.S. forces are pretty thinly spread all over the world, bracing for any eventuality. And of course, it is not unheard of that the commander of a theater will come down with a case of localitis, as it was called during World War II, meaning, as you may guess, that the problems and needs of his own theater will take up so much of his attention that he will become blind to the global responsibility of the U.S. military. Now, I'm not saying that this has affected Ridgway, I'm just saying that it could. I've mentioned before that the Commonwealth forces have been forming their brigades into a Commonwealth Division, and this week that becomes reality. The administrative infrastructure is provided by the UK, and so when London requests that a British Army officer be in command, that gives it a little more weight. Although there have been times in the past when the Australians, New Zealanders, and Canadians experienced dubious British generalship, the guy put forward here, Major General James Cassels, is acceptable to all parties. Cassels' staff had to be seen to be fully integrated, reflecting the national contributions of all concerned. This was achieved with remarkably little friction. Although South Africa was regarded with distaste by Britain's Labour government, its offer of individual officers to serve in staff posts and at regimental duty attached to British units was taken up. The Indian government expressed a wish early in the war for its field ambulance to serve under Commonwealth command, and this duty took place. Cassels isn't the only change to UN command, though. The 1st Commonwealth Division is assigned to U.S. 1st Corps in the 8th Army, and 1st Corps 2 has a new commander, John Iron Mike O'Daniel. Both Cassels and O'Daniel have impressive backgrounds. During World War II, Cassels served in Western Europe after the Normandy landings, and he became the 2nd youngest British divisional commander of the war. Want to know something? Between the wars, Cassels played first-class cricket. He was both an excellent bowler and batsman, and was even on the Egyptian national team. As for Iron Mike, he served with the famous U.S. 3rd Infantry Division in North Africa, Sicily, Italy, and Western Europe. He was actually Audie Murphy's commanding general, and it was the 3rd Division that captured Berchtesgaden in May 1945. O'Daniels apparently took as a trophy a pair of Hermann Goering's pants, which he called a lot of pants. Cassels and O'Daniels get along, but they do not always see eye to eye. He at once impressed on his subordinates the need for aggression at all levels and at all times. In his reports to the War Office, Cassels frequently reveals his impatience at orders from above which seemed to have little relevance. There was constant pressure to take prisoners, difficult when the Chinese refused combat, and superfluous when battalions already knew which enemy units were deployed to their front. O'Daniels decreed that raids to obtain prisoners were to be undertaken at least every 3rd day, apparently, as Cassels wrote, regardless of cost. He recognized that this was part of O'Daniel's policy of keeping the troops sharp, also that several American units had already incurred heavy and, to his mind, unnecessary losses while trying to oblige. The commander of the 1st U.S. Marine Division, reassuringly deployed immediately to the left of the Commonwealth Division, agreed with Cassels. The individual brigades have given up some of their support elements, which have been grouped as divisional elements. Canadian, British, and New Zealand transport companies became a divisional column, battalion-sized. So too were brigade signals and engineer squadrons formed into divisional regiments. But you know, if the peace talks go well, those guys won't have to do much fighting. The last day of the talks last week really was the 21st, and the communist side asked for a recess until the 25th at the end of the week so that each side can consider the views presented by the other side. The talks resume, and the withdrawal of foreign troops issue is tabled for now. On the 26th, the revised agenda has a few main items: truce line, exchange of POWs, how to enforce the armistice, and I guess recommendations to governments. Washington is pretty happy with at least some progress being made, but someone is not. South Korean President Syngman Rhee. Rhee didn't think the talks were going to lead to any sort of agreement, and certainly not the adoption of the actual agenda. So when that happens, he tells his delegate, Paek Sun-yup, to boycott the talks. U.S. Ambassador John Muccio manages to talk Rhee round, and Paek will return to the talks for the time being at least, but Muccio tells American Secretary of State Dean Acheson this indicates Rhee might be intent on sabotaging the talks. But on the 27th, while Paek is still away, the others talk about the first thing on the agenda, a truce line. With the troop withdrawal issue tacitly put aside, the UN negotiators hoped to speed the pace of the talks. They were sorely disappointed. Immediately, the communists renewed their demands that the 38th parallel be the demarcation line when the truce was signed. To call the communists obstinate is to understate. Regardless of the UN pleas, the communists pointed to the parallel, said that was the only line they would consider, and refused to discuss the issue further. The parallel was consistent with historical fact and basic to the armistice talks. They have, in fact, said several times before this day that they would not consider another line. And remember, Acheson did publicly say, as did UN Secretary General Trygve Lie, that they were open to the 38th parallel being the truce line. This was a couple months ago, sure, and things have changed on the ground since then, but still. On the 28th, Nam Il, who apparently is shocked by the detailed nature of Turner-Joy's proposal, which indicates that it's not just a bargaining position, but what Nam sees as reneging on publicly held positions, Nam has a big anti-West speech and brings up the 38th parallel. His side maintains that since the war began with one belligerent violating the line, and he claims it was the ROK, the South Koreans, but whoever it was, they say that since that's how the war began, it can't be stopped with one belligerent still violating that line. And since just now each side has forces on both sides of the line, it's still the best demarcation point. Turner-Joy and the UN delegates respond with a variety of arguments, which the other side just doesn't even seem interested in hearing, let alone considering. When the UN forces were crammed into the Pusan perimeter last summer, would they really have accepted the 38th parallel then? Or then in November, when the UN forces had advanced all the way to the Yalu, would the UN have accepted the 38th parallel? Joy also argues there isn't really just one war zone. There are, in fact, three of them. There's an aerial zone, right? And the UN controls the skies all the way up to the Yalu River. And what about the naval zone? Yep, the UN controls the waters around the entire peninsula. So if they were to withdraw south in the air and naval zones, that would be the same as the Chinese and North Koreans withdrawing to the north in the ground zone. So Joy and company are still pushing for a 35-kilometer deep demilitarized zone whose southern edge follows the current battle lines. If the other side would pull back its ground forces to make that work, UN command would stop naval action along the coasts from the southern edge of the line up to the North Korean border, and stop aerial activity from the northern edge of the line to the border, which would be a pretty big deal. In fact, Dean Rusk, who we've seen works at the State Department with Far Eastern Affairs, tells Allied ambassadors that he intends to be quite firm on these terms. The ambassadors say, sure. The communist delegation does not. Nam Il is officially the head of their team, and he has this to say to Turner-Joy. Seeing that you make such a completely absurd and arrogant statement, for what actually have you come here? Have you come to negotiate for peace, or just to look for an excuse for continuing the war? Joy points out that just the fact there is a UN delegation in Kaesong means they're trying to find an equitable way to peace. And P.S., if Nam Il continues to be so rude and discourteous, then the UN will conclude it is the communist side that is not negotiating in good faith. Nam Il then changes his tone, adopting a far more moderate attitude, although still not giving up his position. The suspicious Joy decided that Nam was either probing for a compromise offer by the UN or awaiting further instructions from Peking. By now, the admiral had detected a pattern in the communist arguments. After a 1 or 2 day break, Nam Il would speak firmly on the issue at hand. But if the UN offered any new ideas, he would filibuster away the rest of the day, obviously powerless to bargain without specific authorization from superiors. And that is where it stands at the end of the week in Kaesong. Well, in Korea in general. With the talks still mired in controversy, both sides building up during the talks, and a new Commonwealth Division on the ground. That division is 58% British, 22% Canadian, 14% Australian, 5% New Zealander, and 1% Indian. That is a pretty global mix. And add that to all the other UN member states who sent troops to Korea, and you see a truly global effort to fight the communist forces. But the fight is also, unlike the last global effort against the Axis forces, not spread out over thousands upon thousands of kilometers in fronts around the world, but just dozens of kilometers along a line. And at times even fewer than that, in one little, often overlooked peninsula. But that's the goal, the overriding one, to prevent this war from spreading beyond that peninsula. Because another global war, well, it's a real possibility. And that's why this war in Korea may to the world population at large be unpopular, overlooked, and even ignored. But it is also very, very important. A lot of what happens in the late 1940s and early 1950s is overlooked in 2025, but is still important to understand the world of today. To learn more about that time period, check out our War to War series on the Time Ghost History channel and be very impressed. That and this, all of our content, is produced thanks to the sterling efforts of the Time Ghost Army. This channel's Time Ghost Army member of the week is Robert Block. Do not forget to subscribe. See you next time.